Laughter exploded through the hall like a gunshot. A man she had once trusted stood up at the harvest social and told the entire room he could not marry a woman built like a draft horse. The crowd roared with him. Some clapped. A boy in the back whistled low and mean. She stood perfectly still in the center, spine straight, hands at her sides, refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. She did not cry where they could see. 3 days later, she opened the newspaper to the matrimonial advertisements. Most wanted slight of build. Gentle disposition. One did not, rancher, Montana Territory. Seeks correspondence with honest woman of good character. Land is hard. So is the work. Looking for someone who won't be frightened off by either. She wrote back that same night. Now the train was gone. She sat on a splintered bench beneath a sky too wide for comfort. No rider came. 1 hour, then 2. The station agent locked up and left without a word. Night fell hard. Still nothing moved in the dark. She kept her chin high, but deep in her chest, the first true crack had already begun to open. The trunk was the only thing she owned that didn't have a story of rejection attached to it. Augusta Pell ran her palm over its battered lid one more time. Worn leather. Brass corners gone soft with age. Inside it, 3 dresses. A Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a folded letter she had read, so many times the creases had turned the paper the color of weak tea. She had grown up in a row house on the street where every window faced another window, where the sun came in sideways for an hour in the morning and then gave up. Her father had been a clerk, careful with numbers, careless with money, the kind of man who could balance a stranger's ledger to the penny and still die owing the butcher $11. Her mother had been small, delicate-boned. The neighbors used to say, as though it were an achievement, Augusta had come out of her mother's small body at 9 pounds and never stopped growing from there. By 12, she was taller than her father. By 16, she could carry a barrel of flour up 2 flights of stairs without setting it down to rest, and had done it once, in front of half the church social, because a deacon's wife had bet her husband a nickel that the girl couldn't. She'd won the man his nickel. He'd never once thanked her. Just looked at her like she'd done something faintly indecent, by being strong enough to prove it. That was the lesson Lowell taught her, over and over, in 100 small humiliations. A woman's body was supposed to need help, was supposed to be lifted into carriages, not lift the carriages herself. And when a woman's body refused to need anyone, the town didn't know what to do with her except laugh, or look away, or both. Her mother had tried, in her own quiet way, to soften the edges of it. Augusta still remembered the night, not long before the fever took her, when her mother had sat at the foot of her bed and told her, in a voice gone thin with illness, that there was nothing wrong with a woman built to last, that the world simply hadn't caught up yet to knowing what to do with a girl who didn't break. Augusta had been 17, had not believed her, had thought privately that her mother was only saying it because mothers were obligated to say kind things to daughters. The rest of the world had already judged. It was only years later, long after her mother was gone, that she understood. The words hadn't been comfort at all. They had been a kind of inheritance. The only one her mother had left to give her that the lawyer couldn't take back. Her mother died when Augusta was 19. Her father followed 2 winters later, the debts coming out of the walls like moths once he was in the ground. By the time the lawyer finished explaining what was left to her, which was nothing, less than nothing, a stack of unpaid bills wearing her father's signature on, Augusta had already understood the shape of her own future. She would work, she would be capable, and she would, almost certainly, do it alone. That might have been bearable on its own, a quiet, sturdy kind of life. The kind her mother had half promised her, in that thin voice at the foot of the bed, though even her mother couldn't have known exactly what shape it would take. It might have been bearable, if not for Reuben Castor. The train rattled beneath her. Had been rattling for 3 days now, long enough that her body had stopped fighting the rhythm and started moving with it instead. She was 23 years old. She was alone in the world. And she was, by every measure anyone in Lowell, Massachusetts had ever cared to use, too much, too tall, too broad through the shoulder, too much woman crammed into a world built for women half her size. She'd heard it her whole life, whispered behind hands at church socials, shouted once, cruelly, by a boy who'd asked her to dance on a dare, and then announced to the whole room that dancing with her was like dancing with a barn door. She had been 16. She remembered every word. Augusta closed her eyes against the rocking of the train car and let herself, for just a moment, return to that row house kitchen. One more time, the smell of her father's pipe smoke, the particular blue of her mother's last winter quilt, the sound of debts arriving in the mail like small funeral notices, one after another, until there was nothing left of a careful man's life except other men's anger at not being paid. She had survived all of it, had survived being too tall for the doorways and too strong for the dances, and too much, always too much, for a town that had decided, long before she was old enough to argue, exactly what a woman was supposed to be. She had thought foolishly that surviving Lowell would be the hardest part. There had been other small cruelties along the way, too many to count. The way a stone gathers moss simply by sitting still long enough in a damp place. The dressmaker who'd once measured her for a Sunday dress and made a small, surprised sound, quickly swallowed, when the tape ran out before the waist did. The schoolteacher who'd asked her, not unkindly, whether she didn't think it might be better to sit in the back, where her height wouldn't block the smaller children's view of the chalkboard, as though her presence itself were an obstruction to be managed, rather than a child seeking the same education as anyone else. She had learned, by 10, to apologize before she was asked to, by 14, to make herself useful in ways that might excuse the space she took up, carrying, lifting, fixing. Anything that turned her size into something other people could be grateful for rather than embarrassed by. It was a strange kind of arithmetic, she would think later, looking back on those years. As though a girl built generously had to earn through labor. The right other girls were simply given at birth. The right to exist in a room without first proving her existence was worth the inconvenience. Her mother had understood this, in her own quiet way, better than anyone. Had never once asked Augusta to make herself smaller. Had instead, in the last years of her illness, begun teaching her daughter something else entirely. Not how to shrink, but how to stand. How to meet a room's silence, with her chin level and her shoulders back, the way her mother herself, small as she was, had learned to meet a husband's debts and a town's quiet judgments, without ever once apologizing for simply being alive. It was a lesson Augusta would spend years failing to fully learn, and only later understand she had been carrying all along. Reuben Castor sold dry goods 2 streets over. He had a kind face, the sort of face that made you trust him before he'd earned it, and he had courted her for the better part of a year, with a patience she'd mistaken for tenderness. He brought her ribbon. He walked her home from church. He told her once, in a low voice meant only for her, that he didn't mind that she was tall, that some men liked a woman with some substance to her. She had believed, God help her, that this was a compliment. She had let herself imagine, in the quiet hours after his visits, what it might be like to be chosen, not tolerated, not laughed at behind a raised hand. Chosen, the way smaller women were chosen, with flowers and Sunday dinners, and a ring that fit a finger no one had ever called too large. For 11 months she had let that hope grow, careful as a seedling, in the small, dark space behind her ribs where she kept the things she didn't dare say out loud. She had pictured a house, a modest one, nothing grand, but hers, a kitchen where she would not have to duck under the lintel, a bed long enough for her to lie flat without her feet hanging off the end of it. She had pictured, foolishly, a husband who would stand beside her at the market and not flinch when the other wives looked. So, when he stood up at the harvest social, in front of the minister, in front of the deacon's wife, who'd once bet a nickel on her strength, in front of nearly everyone Augusta had ever known, and announced, laughing, that he could not in good conscience marry a woman built like a draft horse. The room had laughed with him, not all of them, but enough that the sound of it would follow her for the rest of her life. The particular pitch of 24 people deciding, all at once, that her humiliation was the evening's entertainment. Augusta had stood very still in the middle of that laughter. The way she imagined a tree stood still in a storm it couldn't outrun, and had not given a single one of them the satisfaction of tears. She had walked home with her spine straight and her chin level, past the lit windows of houses where families she had known her whole life were no doubt still repeating the joke to each other, still finding new ways to be amused by it. Only once the door was shut behind her had she allowed herself to sit down on the kitchen floor and shake. She did not cry that night either. She had promised herself, somewhere around her 19th birthday, the year her mother died, that she would not spend her tears on people who had already spent their decency. What she did instead, 3 days later, sitting at the same kitchen table where her father had once balanced other men's debts to the penny, was open a newspaper to the matrimonial advertisements and read every single one twice. Most were from men describing exactly what they wanted in a wife, the way they might describe a horse they intended to buy. Slight of build, fair of face, of a gentle and yielding disposition, she read them and felt, with each line, the particular tightening in her chest that came from being reminded, over and over, of the shape a woman was supposed to take in order to be wanted. She had nearly given up, had nearly folded the paper and accepted that there was no place in the territories, any more than there was in Lowell, for a woman like her. Then she found Thaddeus Corrigan's notice, 4 lines. No mention of build, or face, or disposition at all. Rancher, Montana Territory. Seeks correspondence with honest woman of good character. Land is hard, so is the work. Looking for someone who won't be frightened off by either. It was the first advertisement she had ever read that seemed to be looking for a person instead of a shape. She wrote back that same evening, her pen moving fast and certain across the page, the words coming easier than they had in months. And when his reply came, careful, plain spoken entirely without flattery, something in her chest unclenched for the first time since the harvest social. A second letter followed 3 days after that first one went out. Then a third. By the time 6 months had passed, the correspondence had become the only thing in her life that didn't feel like waiting to be laughed at. That had been 6 months ago. Now the letters lived in her trunk, tied with string, and the train was slowing. And the conductor was calling out a name she had said to herself in the dark so many times it didn't sound real anymore. Thaddeus Corrigan's letters had not been like Reuben's ribbon and flattery. They had been short, practical. He wrote about the price of cattle and the unpredictability of the creek in spring. He wrote about a ranch his father had carved out of raw mountain ground and a house that had stood empty, in one way or another, for longer than he cared to put into words. He had never once commented on what she looked like, because she had never told him, and he had never asked. It was his third letter that had decided her. She had written him a single timid line, a question disguised as a comment, the kind of thing a woman asks when she's afraid of the answer, wondering aloud whether the ranch house got much light. He had written back, the kitchen window faces east. You'll have the morning sun for your bread. It was such a small thing, and yet it had undone her completely, sitting alone in that row house with its sideways hour of sun, because no one, in 23 years, had ever thought to offer her morning light as though she deserved it without having to earn it first. She had packed her trunk that same week. The 3 days on the train had given her too much time to think, which was, she'd decided, somewhere around Ohio, the cruelest thing about long journeys. There was nothing to do but watch the country change outside the window and turn her own life over and over in her hands like a stone she couldn't put down. She had watched the green hills of the east give way to flat, country, and then watched the flat country begin to buckle and rise into shapes that scraped at the sky. And somewhere in all that watching, a thought had lodged itself in her chest and refused to leave. What if Thaddeus Corrigan, upon seeing her step off the train, did exactly what every other man in Lowell had done? What if 4 lines in a newspaper and a handful of plain, careful letters had simply been the long way around to the same old ending? She had told herself fiercely that it wouldn't matter. That she had survived worse, would survive this too. That she had a small inheritance left over for a return ticket if it came to that. She had not entirely believed herself, but she had said it anyway. The way you say a thing you need to be true, often enough that it starts to feel like it might be. Beside her, an older woman traveling to join a daughter in Helena had spent most of the second day talking, the way some people did to fill the silence of a long journey. She had asked Augusta, kindly enough, whether she had family waiting at the other end. A correspondence, Augusta had said, which was true, and also the only answer that didn't invite further questions she wasn't ready to answer. The woman had nodded, satisfied, and gone back to her knitting, and Augusta had gone back to the window, to the mountains rising slow and patient against a sky that seemed, the further west they traveled, to grow wider and wider, as though making room for something. She thought of her mother in those long hours. Thought of the thin voice at the foot of the bed, the promise that the world simply hadn't caught up yet. She wondered whether Montana might be the place that had. She thought, too, of her father, and the particular shame that he'd never meant to leave behind, and found herself hoping, in the quiet privacy of her own mind, that wherever he was now, he understood she had not run from Lowell out of weakness. She had run from it the way a person runs from a house on fire. Not because she lacked courage, but because there was nothing left worth staying for. The train made a brief stop in a small Ohio town somewhere past midday, and Augusta had stepped out onto the platform for a few minutes, simply to feel solid ground beneath her feet after so many hours of rocking. A boy selling apples from a basket had looked up at her. Really looked, the open, curious stare of a child who hadn't yet learned the careful blankness adults practiced, and asked her, without malice, how tall she was exactly. She had told him, 6 feet near enough. He had whistled, impressed rather than alarmed, and asked whether she'd ever thought of joining a circus, the way some boys his age might admire a particularly fine horse or an unusually large dog, with simple, uncomplicated wonder, rather than judgment. She had laughed, surprised herself by laughing, the first real laugh in weeks, and bought an apple from him before climbing back aboard. It had stayed with her, that small exchange, longer than she expected. A reminder that not every set of eyes that landed on her carried the same weight of disapproval she'd learned to brace for. Some, like a child's, simply saw size as a fact rather than a flaw. She held that small kindness close through the rest of the journey, the way you hold a coin found unexpectedly in an old coat pocket. Not enough to change anything, but enough to remind you that the world still occasionally surprised you in good ways. Bridger gap, bridger gap. Her heart did something complicated. Lifted and dropped in the same breath. She stood, smoothed her gray traveling dress over hips that no dress had ever been cut to flatter. Picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing, because to her it didn't, and stepped down onto a platform of splintered wood, under a sky so wide it made her dizzy. The air smelled like pine, like dust, like something wild she had no name for, and it was empty, no man waiting. No tall stranger with dark hair, the kind Thaddeus Corrigan had described in his last letter. Just a bench, a shuttered station house, a water tower standing guard over nothing at all. She sat, folded her hands, waited. She was good at waiting, had been doing it her whole life, in one form or another. Waiting to grow into a body that fit. Waiting for someone to look past the size of her and see the rest. Waiting, now, for a man who had promised in ink that he would be here. At first she told herself it meant nothing. A horse could have thrown a shoe. A calf could have wandered into the wrong pasture. A man building a life out of raw mountain ground had 100 reasons to run late that had nothing to do with the woman waiting for him. She held on to that explanation the way she'd once held on to Reuben Castor's compliments, carefully, with both hands. Even as the light began to fail and the explanation began, slowly, to feel less like comfort and more like something she was telling herself because the alternative was unbearable. The sun dropped behind the mountains like it had somewhere better to be, huh? An hour passed, then another. A stooped station agent locked up the little house, tipped his hat to her without a word, and walked off toward the lights of town. And Augusta understood, the way you understand a held breath has to end eventually, that no one was coming, not tonight, maybe not ever. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury for women who could afford to look fragile, and she had learned a long time ago that she could not, so she sat, alone, in the dark, in a town she had crossed half a country to reach, with nothing but a trunk and a stack of lies tied up in string, and let herself, for just one moment, hate every single person who had ever made her believe that being too much was the same thing as being unworthy of being met. The sound of hooves came slow. Unhurried, a rider emerged from the dark, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies, and pulled up short at the edge of the platform. He didn't say anything at first, just looked, which was nothing new. People always looked first, except this time the silence didn't feel like judgment. It felt like calculation. Like a man doing arithmetic in his head and getting an answer he hadn't expected. He swung down, boots hitting the dust with a soft, solid thud. And as he walked closer, the lantern light from the station house caught him fully for the first time, and Augusta forgot for one full second to breathe. Because he was tall, not tall the way men were sometimes called tall, with an inch or two to spare. Tall the way she was tall, broad through the shoulder the way she was broad. A man built on the same scale as her, standing in front of her on an empty platform, and for the first time in her adult life, she did not have to tilt her head back to meet someone's eyes. She had to look up only a little. It indicated something in her chest she hadn't known was tied shut, ma'am. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a road that had seen too many winters. Last train's been and gone, I know. He nodded. Didn't ask who she'd been waiting for. Didn't ask why they hadn't come. Just looked at her, really looked, the way some men looked at horses before they bought them, except there was nothing cold in it. Nothing measuring her against some smaller, safer idea of a woman. If anything, his gaze seemed to catch on her shoulders, her hands, the set of her spine, and something in his face. She couldn't name it yet. Wouldn't let herself try, because she had seen that look before, hadn't she? Had spent 23 years learning every version of it. The pity look, the amusement look, the careful, polite blankness of men who didn't want to be caught staring at a woman, built wrong for her sex. This wasn't any of those. This was closer to recognition, like he was looking at something he understood from the inside out. She told herself not to read anything into it, told herself fiercely, the way she'd told herself 100 things over the years that she needed to believe and didn't quite. He's only being decent. Decent men exist. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. Town's a fair walk, he said. There's a boarding house, clean. Run by a good woman. She looked at the dark road behind him. Then back at the platform, empty and indifferent. She had nowhere else to go. So she said the only thing that made sense. Thank you. He reached for her trunk. She almost stopped him out of habit. Because men who tried to lift her things usually regretted it, usually strained something, usually made a joke about her packing rocks. But he didn't joke. He didn't strain. He hefted it onto the mule with one clean motion, like it weighed nothing at all, the way she might have lifted it herself. She watched him do it and felt something shift, quietly. Like a door easing open she hadn't realized was shut. Augusta Pell. She said, "That is Corrigan." A pause. "Folks, call me Thad." They walked. The only sound, the creak of harness leather, and the soft scuff of boots in dust, and Augusta found herself matching his stride without trying, which had never once happened to her with any man in Lowell, Massachusetts. The boarding house glowed warm against the dark, a hand-painted sign swinging gently. Gables, rooms for travelers. A stout woman opened the door before they'd reached the gate. Sharp eyes, graying hair pulled back hard enough to mean business. Thaddeus Corrigan. Her eyebrows climbed. Didn't expect you till next month. Evening. Mrs. Pruitt. He nodded toward Augusta. This lady needs a room. Mrs. Pruitt's gaze swept over Augusta. The height of her, the breadth of her, the dust on her hem and the exhaustion under her eyes. And something in the older woman's face softened in a way Augusta had learned over 23 years. Not to expect, of course, she held the door wider. Come in, dear. You look done in. Augusta turned back to Thaddeus, the words of gratitude already rising in her throat. But he was already speaking, fast, low, like a man settling a debt before anyone could argue the terms. Put her weak, on my account, Mrs. Pruitt, and then he touched the brim of his hat, turned, and was gone. Back into the dark he'd come from, no explanation, no lingering. Like a man who had done exactly what needed doing, and nothing more. Augusta stood on the porch, a moment longer than she should have, watching the place where he disappeared. The room was small. Narrow bed, patchwork quilt. A washstand with a chipped pitcher and a single window facing a street gone quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the control she had carried for 3 days. Through the train, through the empty platform, through the slow horror of being left twice in one lifetime, by 2 different men in 2 different states, finally broke. The tears came hot. Silent, for Reuben Castor and his barn-door joke. For Thaddeus's letters, the ones that hadn't promised her anything, except plain talk, and a roof, the ones she had let herself believe in anyway. For every year of her life spent folding herself smaller in rooms built for smaller women. She did not know yet that the man who'd carried her trunk had a grief of his own, buried somewhere on that ranch. Did not know that the empty platform he'd ridden past every month on the night the last train came through was its own kind of ritual. She lay awake long after the tears had finally run their course, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a town settling into night, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the creak of the boarding house itself shifting against the wind, the distant murmur of voices from what she guessed was the saloon Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned in passing. None of it sounded like Lowell. None of it sounded like home, not yet. But there was something in the strangeness of it that felt, if not comforting exactly, at least honest. A new place that owed her nothing and had promised her nothing, except perhaps the quiet decency of a man who hadn't laughed. She only knew that for one strange, suspended moment on a dark platform, a stranger had looked at her and not flinched. It was not love. It was not even hope, not yet, but it was something. A crack of light under a door she had assumed was nailed shut for good. The week passed in the particular shame of being a guest who couldn't pay her own way. Augusta took her meals in Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen, helped with the washing, the mending, anything to feel less like charity and more like a person-like person. Mrs. Pruitt, she learned, was not just a landlady. She ran the town's post office out of her front parlor, which made her the central nervous system of every piece of gossip in Bridger Gap. She had sharp opinions, and beneath them, a soft and watchful heart. She did not pry. For which Augusta was grateful in a way she didn't have words for yet. She saw Thaddeus only once that week. He rode in for supplies, face set in the same serious lines, and did not so much as glance toward the boarding house. Tethered his horse, loaded his goods, rode out again, a man who kept to himself. Watching from her window, Augusta felt something she refused to name. A pang, a pull. The particular ache of wanting to be looked at again by someone who hadn't flinched. She asked Mrs. Pruitt about him once, carefully. Sideways, the way you ask about a thing you're afraid of caring about. Mr. Corrigan keeps to himself, Mrs. Pruitt said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. Has for some years now, has he always? The older woman's needle paused. just for a second. Long enough that Augusta noticed. "No," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Not always." And then, in the tone of a woman closing a door gently rather than slamming it, she added, "It isn't my story to tell, dear, but he's a good man. Whatever else he is, he's that." Augusta did not press further, but she carried the exchange with her, up the stairs that night, turning it over the way she might turn over a coin. Found in the street, not valuable on its own, but proof that something had been dropped there once by someone. She thought of the way he had not asked her a single question on that platform. Not who she'd been waiting for, not why they hadn't come. As though he understood instinctively that some grief doesn't want company. Only witness, she wondered, lying in the dark of Mrs. Pruitt's narrow guest bed. What grief he was carrying, that had taught him that particular kindness. In the days that followed, she found herself calling her attention to the small rhythms of Mrs. Pruitt's household. The way the older woman moved through her mornings with brisk, practiced efficiency, sorting mail and tending the front parlor stove and managing somehow to remember every boarder's particular preferences without ever seeming to consult a list. There was a comfort in watching competence at work, the way Augusta had always found comfort in numbers that balanced, in tasks completed properly. She helped where she could, folded linens, carried water, sat with Mrs. Pruitt some evenings, listening to the older woman's stories of the town, who had married whom, whose cattle had wandered, onto whose land, the slow accumulating gossip of a place where everyone's business eventually became everyone's business. For better or worse, it was in its own way a kind of education. Augusta began to understand the shape of Bridger Gap, the way she might once have studied a new ledger, learning its patterns, its quirks, the particular accounting of who owed kindness to whom. On the second day, Mrs. Pruitt sent her to the general store for thread. It should have been nothing, a short walk, a simple errand. But Augusta had forgotten, somewhere in the long blur of train cars and empty platforms, what it felt like to walk into a room full of strangers who had never seen her before. The bell over the door rang. Conversation stopped, not all at once, not dramatically. Just a pause, a beat too long. Two women near the fabric bolts exchanging a glance that Augusta had learned, over 23 years, to read in less than a second. There she is. That's the size of her. She kept her chin level, walked to the counter, asked for the thread in a voice that did not waver, because wavering was a thing she had taught herself out of years ago, the same way she'd taught herself not to duck through doorways that were tall enough for anyone else. The shopkeeper, an older man, with kind eyes and a slow way of moving, measured out the thread without comment, without staring, which was, by the low standard the world had set for her, a kindness in itself. But behind her, low enough to be deniable, loud enough to be heard she came off the train for Coring's ranch. Lord, he'll need a bigger door, soft laughter. The kind that didn't even know it was cruel. The kind that thought itself harmless because no one had bothered to say the words directly to her face. Augusta paid for the thread, did not turn around. Walked out with her spine straight and her parcel held against her chest-like armor, and made it almost to the end of the street before her hands started shaking. She stopped, breathed, made herself stop, because crying in the street would only give them more to talk about. Because she had survived worse than this in Lowell, with an audience twice the size and stakes that had actually mattered. Because, and this was the thought that finally steadied her, Thaddeus Corrigan had stood 3 feet from her on that platform, in worse light, with nothing to gain by being kind, and he had not laughed once. So, 2 strangers in a dry goods store did not get to undo that. She straightened her shoulders and walked the rest of the way back to Mrs. Pruitt's. On the 7th day, panic had started to coil tight in her chest. No plan past it, no family to write to, no trade except the bookkeeping skills she'd learned from her father, a man who died owing more than he'd ever earned, and a stubborn refusal to be anyone's burden. She had begun that morning to compose a letter in her head. An advertisement of a different kind. For work this time, not marriage. Housekeeper. Seamstress. Anything that would let her earn her bread without depending on a stranger's charity for a single day longer than necessary. She had gotten as far as young woman, capable and willing before she heard his voice downstairs. A knock at her door. "Mr. Corrigan's here to see you," Mrs. Pruitt said, her face unreadable in a way that meant she was working very hard to keep it that way. Augusta came down to find him standing in the small front parlor, hat in his hands, filling the room not with size alone but with something steadier. Something that made the air feel less crowded, not more, Miss Pels. He didn't waste time. "Mrs. Pruitt tells me you've a good head for figures." Augusta glanced at the older woman, who gave the smallest nod, the kind that confessed to having bragged on someone's behalf and didn't regret it. "I'm competent," Augusta said. "I'm not blunt. Like the words cost him something to say, but he was paying anyway. My books are 3 years gone to ruin. Receipts in drawers, numbers in margins. I need someone to make sense of it." He looked at her directly. Didn't look away, the way most men did when a conversation ran too long. Like staying too close to her was a thing to be managed. "There's a room off the main house. I'll pay fair wage. Board stays here with Mrs. Pruitt." It was not a proposal. It was not even particularly kind on its face, blunt as a closed fist. But Augusta understood, the way she understood the weight of her own trunk, exactly what it was. A door, open just wide enough to walk through. "Yes," she said. The word came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Corrigan, I'll do it." The walk back to Mrs. Pruitt's that evening felt different than any walk Augusta had taken in years. She kept turning the offer over as she went. The way she'd turn over a coin to check it wasn't counterfeit. A room. A wage. A reason to stay in Bridger Gap that had nothing to do with charity, and everything to do with what she could do with her own 2 hands and a clear head for figures. It should have felt like rescue. In a way, she supposed it was. But it didn't sit in her chest the way rescue usually sat, heavy with obligation threaded through with the quiet expectation of gratitude paid back in smiles and silence. It sat, instead, like something closer to respect. As though Thaddeus Corrigan had looked at the wreckage of her circumstances and seen underneath it a woman capable of fixing something rather than a problem that needed managing. She had not been looked at that way in a very long time. Possibly not ever. She arrived at her room above Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen and sat by the window for a long while, watching the last of the light drain out of the sky over the mountains, and allowed herself, just for a moment, the dangerous luxury of hope. Not hope for romance. She was not foolish enough, not anymore, to let herself hope for that so soon after Reuben Castor had taught her exactly what hoping cost. But hope for something steadier, a place to stand, a use for her hands and her mind that didn't require her to apologize first for taking up space. It was, she thought, a smaller hope than the one she'd carried west on the train. But it felt somehow more solid. Like the difference between a house built on borrowed ground and one built on rock, that had been there long before anyone thought to build on it at all. She packed her trunk again the next morning. The second time in 6 months, she had packed everything she owned into one battered case and walked toward a future she could not fully see the shape of. But this time, she noticed her hands did not shake. His ranch sat 5 miles out in a valley, cut by a creek that ran clear, even in late summer. A simple house, hewn logs and a wide porch facing the mountains. A man's house, clean, bare of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The room he showed her had clearly been a storage space until recently. Tack and crates pushed hastily to one side, a layer of dust disturbed in patterns that told her he'd cleared it himself that morning in a hurry. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, the first soft thing she'd heard in his voice. "It will do." He showed her where the ledgers were kept, a drawer so crowded with paper it would not close all the way, like a wound that had scarred over wrong. And then, turning to leave, his eyes moved just for a second to a closed door at the end of the hall. He didn't explain it. Didn't even seem to realize he'd looked. But Augusta noticed, filed it away the way she filed away a column of figures that didn't balance yet. Not solved, just marked, waiting for more information. And so her new life began. The first evening, she had assumed she would eat alone in her small room, the way a hired hand might, separate from the family that wasn't hers. She had set herself up with bread and cold meat from a basket Mrs. Pruitt had sent along, and was halfway through the first bite when Thaddeus appeared, in the doorway looking faintly confused, as though she had broken some rule he hadn't thought to write down. "There's a table," he said, nodding toward the main room. Plenty of room at it. It was such a small thing. An invitation extended in 4 words, gruff and unpolished. And yet Augusta felt it land somewhere unexpected, because in Lowell she had eaten at the edges of rooms her entire adult life, tucked into corners where her size wouldn't crowd anyone else's comfort. She gathered her plate and followed him. They ate mostly in silence that first night. He was not a man who filled space with talk for talk's own sake, and she had learned. Growing up in a house where every word her father spoke seemed to be calculating some debt he couldn't pay, that silence, shared honestly, was better than conversation, spent performing ease neither of you felt. Near the end of the meal, though, he surprised her. "My father built this table," he said, a thumb along a groove in the wood worn smooth by years of hands. "Built the whole house. Came out here with nothing but a wagon and my mother, and more stubbornness than sense. What happened to them? Winter took my mother when I was 12. Father held on another decade after that. Ran this place near into the ground, grieving her, the last few years. I spent most of my 20s pulling it back out," he said it plainly. No bitterness in it, no plea for sympathy. Just a man stating the facts of his life, the way he might state the price of cattle. But Augusta heard, underneath the words, the shape of something she recognized. A man who understood the way she understood. What it cost to keep a thing standing after the people who built it had stopped being able to hold it up themselves. "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged, the motion economical, almost dismissive. "Long time ago." It wasn't, she thought, watching him gather the plates. Not really. Grief like that didn't move on a calendar. It moved at its own pace, in its own time, and she suspected, though she didn't yet have proof, that whatever lived behind that closed door at the end of the hall moved at a pace all its own as well. She helped him clear the table that first night, the two of them moving around the small kitchen with the careful, unpracticed politeness of strangers learning each other's habits. He showed her where the dishes belonged. She noticed, without saying anything, that the shelves were arranged with a particular logic. Heaviest items low, lightest high. Everything within easy reach of a man who lived alone and had no one to hand things down to him. It struck her, drying the last plate by lamplight, that this house had been built for 2 people and had spent 3 years accommodating only 1. The proportions were all slightly wrong for solitude. The table too large, the porch too wide, the second chair by the fire angled just so, as though waiting for someone to fill it. She did not say this aloud. But she carried the observation with her up to her small room that night. Turning it over the way, she turned over everything that mattered and found that for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like an intruder in someone else's life. She felt, instead, like a woman who had wandered, quite by accident, into a space that had been waiting. Each morning she walked the road from the boarding house as the sun came up over the ridge line, and each evening she walked back as it set behind the peaks, and in between she worked. The ledgers were every bit the disaster he'd promised. Numbers scrawled sideways in margins. Receipts shoved between pages like a man trying to bury evidence of his own neglect. Months missing entirely. For most people, it would have been a chore. For Augusta, raised by a father who'd taught her arithmetic before he taught her to read, because he said numbers didn't lie even when people did, It was something closer to a puzzle, a place where her mind could finally do something useful, with all the careful, contained energy she usually had nowhere to put. She worked in fierce, quiet concentration, pen scratching, house silent around her, except for the creak of settling wood. And somewhere outside, the wind moving through pine, Thaddeus was rarely there during the day. Out on the range, mending fences, doing the thousand small, punishing tasks that kept a ranch from falling apart around a man who'd stopped, somewhere along the way, caring. Whether it did, she knew him only by the sounds of his leaving at dawn and his returning at dusk. On the third morning, there was a tin cup of coffee waiting on the corner of her desk. Hot, black, no note. He was nowhere in sight. She drank it slowly, and the warmth spread through her chest like something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The next morning, it was there again. It became a ritual neither of them spoke of. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him for it, because thanking him would have made it a transaction, and somehow she understood without being told that it wasn't meant to be one. It was simply there, every morning. A small, steady fact in a life that had handed her very few of those. In the afternoons, sometimes, he worked on the porch, mending a bridle, sharpening a blade. And she would watch him from her window, learning the particular economy of his movements. A man who never wasted emotion, who carried his sighs the way she had spent her whole life, wishing she could carry hers, without apology. She noticed the set of his shoulders when he was tired, the way he'd pause sometimes and stare at the mountains, like he was drawing something out of them he couldn't get anywhere else. He was a man who spoke in actions instead of words. And he, in turn, she began to notice, watched her too. He'd come in for water and linger a half-second longer in the doorway than the task required. Paka. Watching the light catch in her dark hair, watching the line of concentration between her brows as she worked through a column of figures that had defeated him for 3 years running. He saw the stacks of paper on her desk growing neater by the week, the chaos of his own neglect shrinking under her hand. The house felt different with her in it, less hollow, like a building that had been holding its breath and had finally quietly started breathing again. There was a morning, in the 6th week, when she found him struggling alone with a fence post that had snapped clean through in a windstorm the night before. Heavy, waterlogged oak, the kind that took 2 men to set right, and he had no second man within 5 miles. She did not ask if he needed help. She had learned, over 23 years, that asking gave a man the chance to say no out of pride and then resent her for the offer. So she simply walked over, bent, and lifted the other end. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she braced herself for the old, familiar flicker of discomfort, the look of a man recalculating what kind of woman he was dealing with and not entirely liking the answer. Instead, something in his shoulders eased. On 3 was all he said. They set the post together. Her strength matched evenly against his, no apology offered or expected on either side. And when it was done, he nodded once, like a man closing a ledger that had finally balanced, obliged. He said it was 2 syllables. It was nothing, really. The kind of word men said to each other a dozen times a day without thinking. But no one had ever said it to Augusta before. Not for this. Not for the part of her that could lift what other women couldn't. The part she had spent her whole life being told to apologize for. She walked back to her desk that afternoon, with her chest feeling strangely full, and did not examine why. It was 2 weeks after that Mrs. Pruitt's mail brought a letter for Augusta. Not from Reuben Castor. She had not given him this address. Would not have given him a glass of water if he were dying in the street. But from a cousin back in Lowell, the only relation who still bothered to write. The letter was kind enough. News of weather, of a wedding, of nothing that mattered. But buried in the 3rd paragraph, almost as an afterthought, came the line that made Augusta's hands go still over the page. Reuben Castor is taken up with the Ainsley girl. Small thing, barely comes to his shoulder. Folks say they suit each other. Fine small thing. barely comes to his shoulder. Augusta set the letter down on the kitchen table at Mrs. Pruitt's and sat with it for a long moment, feeling the old wound reopen along exactly the same line it had always split before. Of course he'd found someone smaller. Of course the lesson he'd taught her at the harvest social, that her body was the problem, not his cruelty, had simply gone on to teach itself to the next woman who crossed his path, this time successfully. She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and a letter from a cousin who meant no harm by it wasn't worth breaking that promise. Over. But she carried the weight of it back to the ranch the next morning, heavier than usual, and Thaddeus, who noticed everything she was learning, even when he said nothing about it, seemed to sense the shift in her before she said a single word. He didn't ask. That wasn't his way. He simply worked alongside her differently that day, finding small reasons to pass through the room where she sat with the ledgers, refilling her coffee without being asked, lingering a beat longer than usual in doorways. It was 3 days after that he set the bird on her desk. One afternoon, a month into her work, he came in and set something small on the corner of her desk without a word, a wooden bird, carved with a care that surprised her, head tilted as if mid-song, every feather rendered in patient, careful lines. She looked up at him, startled. "It's beautiful," he shrugged. A flush crept up the back of his neck, visible even under the weathered tan. "Hands get restless," he muttered, and was gone before she could say anything else. She turned the bird over in her palms that evening, alone in her room, and noticed something she hadn't caught at first glance. The wood was old, worn at the base in a way fresh carved wood wouldn't be, as though the piece had started as something else entirely. A scrap salvaged, perhaps, from some other half-finished project, before his knife had found a new shape for it to become. She did not know, yet, where that wood had come from. She only knew that whatever he could not say with words, he was saying with his hands instead, one careful cut at a time, and that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone's silence felt less like rejection and more like the careful, deliberate work of a man building something he was afraid to name out loud. She kept the bird on the corner of her desk. And in the weeks that followed, whenever the old loneliness rose up in her chest, the ghost of every rejection she'd ever swallowed, she would reach out and touch its smooth wooden feathers. It was not a declaration. It was not even close to one. But it was a promise of a different kind. The kind made by a man who didn't trust himself with words, offered to a woman who had spent her whole life being told, in plenty of words, that she was too much, except apparently for him. Sunday came, and with it, the question of church. She had nearly stayed behind at the boarding house, telling herself the walk was long and the work was waiting, but Mrs. Pruitt would not hear of it, and so Augusta found herself walking into the small clapboard church at Bridger Gap, with her best gray dress brushed clean and her spine set for whatever waited inside. What waited was the same thing that always waited. Glances that lingered a beat too long. A child near the front pew who stared openly until his mother pulled his sleeve. The particular, exhausting work of being looked at as a curiosity rather than a person. She took a seat near the back alone and told herself it didn't matter. It was halfway through the second hymn that she felt someone settle into the pew beside her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She had learned, in 6 weeks, the particular weight of his presence, the way the air seemed to organize itself differently around a man built on her own scale. Thaddeus did not say a word, did not explain himself. Just opened his hymnal to the right page and held it slightly toward her, close enough that she could read the words without straining, and stood beside her through the rest of the service like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Read. She noticed, from the corner of her eye, the way several heads turned. The way the deacon's wife, a woman cut from the same cloth as the one, back in Lowell, the kind who collected other people's business like ribbon, leaned toward her neighbor with a whisper that didn't quite stay quiet. didn't know Corrigan kept company. With her of all people, Augusta felt the old heat rise in her chest, the familiar shame that wanted to fold her smaller, make her apologize for taking up a pew, for taking up a Sunday, for taking up space in a town that hadn't asked for her. But Thaddeus, beside her, did not so much as glance toward the whispering, did not flinch or shift away, or do any of the small cowardly things men sometimes did when their company became inconvenient in public. He simply stood there, solid, unbothered, as though her presence beside him required no justification at all. It was, Augusta thought, the loudest thing he had said to her yet, and he hadn't spoken a single word. After the service on the church steps, Mrs. Pruitt caught her arm and steered her gently away from the thinning crowd. "Don't you mind them," the older woman said, low enough that only Augusta could hear. "This is a small town, dear, and small towns talk, because there's precious little else to do with an evening." "It doesn't make them right. I'm used to it," Augusta said. "That's the trouble." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Used to it isn't the same as deserving it. Don't let yourself forget the difference." Augusta said nothing, but she carried the words home with her, turning them over the whole 5 miles back to the ranch, and found that for the first time in longer than she could remember, some small stubborn part of her was starting to believe them. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm she had not expected to find anywhere, let alone here, in a borrowed room off a stranger's hallway. Mornings, coffee, waiting. Afternoons, the scratch of her pen, the distant sound of him working somewhere across the property. The particular comfort of being useful without being looked at like a curiosity. Evenings. Supper at the table his father had built. Conversation that came slow and easy now, like water, finding the path it had always meant to take. She found herself, some nights, lying awake turning the day over in her mind the way she used to turn over Reuben Castor's compliments. Except now, when she examined the day for cruelty hidden inside kindness, she found none. Only a man who left coffee without being asked, who carved birds with restless hands, who had looked at her on an empty platform and seen, apparently, exactly what was there. Nothing more frightening than that. Nothing less, either. She did not let herself call it anything. Not yet. Naming a thing too early, she had learned, was how you handed it to someone else to break. So she worked instead. Because work she trusted. Work had never once, in 23 years, looked at her and laughed. There was an evening, late in the season, when he asked her to walk him through the columns she'd built. Not because he doubted her, he was careful to say, but because a man should understand his own land even when someone else was minding it for him. She had pulled a chair close to his at the kitchen table and she'd shown him, patiently, how the seasons moved through the numbers. How a hard winter showed up months later in thinner columns. How a fair price on cattle in autumn could carry a man clean through to spring if he was careful and ruin him if he wasn't. He had listened the way few people ever listened to her. Not waiting for his turn to speak, not glancing toward the door, but actually following the thread of what she was saying, asking questions that proved he meant it. "You see it the way my father used to talk about the land," he said at one point, watching her trace a column with her finger. "Like it's alive. Like it's telling you something if you listen close enough." "Numbers don't lie," she said. "Even when people do." Something passed over his face then. Quick, gone before she could read it fully, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether he was thinking of his father. Of a decade spent grieving instead of listening. Of land that had nearly told him something important, in numbers, while he'd been too lost to hear it. "My father used to say the same thing," he said quietly. About numbers, it was the closest he had come, in 2 months, to handing her a piece of himself, without her having to go looking for it. She did not press. She had learned, watching him, that some men opened slowly, the way frozen ground gave way to spring. Not all at once, but in patches, here and there, wherever the sun found purchase first. She was patient. She had spent her whole life being patient with people who gave her far less reason to be. She finished the ledgers in late summer. 3 years of chaos folded down into neat, balanced columns. She brought the final book to him one evening on the porch, where he sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the light go gold and then gray over the ridge. He took it, turned the pages slowly. Not reading the numbers, she realized, reading the order of them, the neatness, the proof laid out in ink that someone had walked into the wreckage of his life and made sense of it without being asked twice. "I don't know what to say." His voice was low, rougher than usual. "Thank you, Augusta." It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed somewhere in her chest she hadn't given anyone access to in years. "The work is done," she said quietly. Because it was true. Because the reason she had a room in his house, a wage in her pocket, a place at his table, that reason had just closed itself, neat as the ledger in his hands. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty. The kind that was working something out. "There are other things," he said finally, "that need sorting." It wasn't a question, but it felt like one, hanging there in the dark, between them. And Augusta understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that her answer to it would matter more than anything she'd said since stepping off that train. "I could organize the pantry," she said. And the mending, something in his face, she would think about it for years afterward, came loose. Like a held breath finally let go. "Yes," he said. Too quickly. "The mending." And so she stayed. It was 3 days later that she found the cradle. She hadn't meant to look. Had only gone down the hall searching for a ledger. He swore he'd seen in the spare room, the same spare room with the door he never opened, the one she'd noticed that first afternoon and filed away without understanding why. The door was ajar, just slightly. Enough that the late light fell through it in a single gold stripe across the hallway floor. She should have walked past, she didn't. Inside, dust thick as felt over everything. A single window, curtains drawn, and in the corner, half-finished, the wood gone soft and gray with years of neglect. A cradle, small, carefully built, every joint sanded smooth, the kind of careful a man only brings to something he loves before he stops being able to look at it. It had never been finished. One side stood bare where carving should have gone. A chisel sat beside it on the floor, exactly where it had been set down. Years ago, by the look of the dust. Set down and never picked back up. Augusta stood very still, because she understood, all at once, the way you understand a column of figures, the instant the missing number reveals itself. The closed door. The man who watched the last train every month like a ritual he couldn't explain. The grief Mrs. Pruitt wouldn't name. This was it. This was the shape of what he carried. Her mind went fast then. Faster than she wanted it to, because a cradle meant a child. Except there was no child in this house, which meant the child had never come. Or had come and gone too quickly to leave any other trace behind. And if that was true, then somewhere in this man's past there was a wife, or the shape of one, and a grief so heavy he had shut a door on it, rather than finish the thing his own hands had started. She did not know, could not know, not yet. So she backed out of the room as quietly as she'd entered, pulled the door shut to exactly where it had been, and stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the wood, her heart going hard and slow, because she understood now that she had not simply taken a job mending a stranger's ledgers. She had walked into the middle of someone else's unfinished grief, and she did not yet know whether she was meant to leave it untouched, the way you leave a wound alone to close on its own, or whether some part of her, some part that had spent 23 years, learning exactly what it cost to be left alone, with a wound nobody would help her carry, already knew she wasn't going anywhere at all. She did not mention the cradle, not that night. Not the next morning, when Thaddeus set the coffee on her desk and lingered, the way he always lingered, a half-second too long. Not the evening after that, when he asked her opinion on a calf that wouldn't take to its mother, and she gave it, and he nodded, and they ate supper in the kind of silence that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like company. The days that followed felt different in a way she couldn't entirely name, not worse. Just heavier, somehow, the way air gets heavier before a storm finally breaks. She found herself watching him more closely than before, not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to tenderness, a careful new attention paid to a man whose grief she now understood the shape of, even if she didn't yet know its name. She noticed things she hadn't noticed before. The way he sometimes paused mid-sentence and seemed to catch himself before finishing a thought. The way certain mornings, for no reason she could see, made him quieter than usual, his shoulders carrying something heavier on those particular days. The way he never once, in 2 months, mentioned a wife or a child, not even in passing. Not even when the conversation might have made room for it naturally. She had grown up around grief herself. Had watched her own father carry his after her mother died, the particular silence of a man who didn't have words for the size of what he'd lost. She recognized the same silence in Thaddeus now, except his had been carrying its weight for 3 years instead of 2 winters. And she suspected, though she didn't yet have proof, that 3 years could calcify a man's grief into something closer to a wall than a wound. She told herself she was being patient, waiting for the right moment, waiting for him to open that door himself, the way he'd opened the smaller doors, one careful inch at a time. Except patience, she was learning, had a cost. Because every time she sat across from him now, the cradle sat there too, invisible, heavy. A third presence at the table that neither of them acknowledged and both of them, she suspected, could feel, so she did. What she always did with things too large to carry alone. She went back to the numbers. It was early autumn when the fever took him. She had noticed it first at supper. The way he pushed food around his plate without eating, the particular flush along his cheekbones that didn't come from sun or wind. By the next morning, he hadn't come down for coffee at all, and when she finally knocked on his door and got no answer, she opened it without waiting for permission, the way she'd never once let herself do before he was burning. Sheets soaked through, breath coming shallow and fast, eyes glassy when they finally found hers. Augusta, her name came out cracked. "You shouldn't be in here." "Be quiet," she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, given how hard her heart was working. "You're sick. Properly sick, it's nothing. Fence work, dust in the lungs." "It's a fever, Thaddeus. I've nursed enough of them to know the difference." He didn't have the strength to argue further, which told her more than his words had. She sent word to town, with the boy who delivered milk, twice weekly, asking Mrs. Pruitt to send the doctor if one could be spared, and then she did the only other thing she knew how to do. She stayed. The doctor came 2 days later, the roads being what they were, the distance being what it was, and by then Augusta had already done most of what needed doing. Cool cloth against his forehead through the worst of the night sweats. Broth forced past lips too stubborn to admit they needed feeding. A vigil kept in the hard chair beside his bed, her own exhaustion folded away somewhere she didn't have time to examine. "Lung fever," the doctor said finally, packing his bag. "Caught early enough, thanks to you. Another day untreated, and I'd be telling you a different story." He looked at Augusta with the particular assessing gaze she usually braced herself against. Except this time, instead of measuring her size, he seemed to be measuring something else entirely. "You did right by him," the doctor said. "Most folks out here, alone on a ranch, don't have anyone to notice in time." Augusta did not tell him that she had very nearly not been in this house at all. That a different version of this story ended with Thaddeus alone in that bed, fever climbing unchecked. No one close enough to notice until it was too late to matter. She only nodded. Accepted the doctor's instructions. Went back to the chair beside the bed once he'd gone. It was during the fever, in the long-ordered hours of his worst night, that Thaddeus said the thing she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He was not fully himself. The fever had loosened something in him that his careful, guarded waking mind usually kept locked tight, and his words came slurred, half-dreaming, directed at someone who wasn't entirely Augusta, and wasn't entirely someone else either, Sarah. His hand found hers in the dark, gripping hard enough to ache. "Sarah, don't go. I'll finish it. I promise I'll finish it." Augusta went very still. "I'm not," she started and stopped herself, because correcting a fevered man in the dark felt cruel. Somehow, and because some part of her understood that he needed to say this to someone, even if that someone wasn't entirely present to hear it as intended. "I should have called the doctor sooner," he said, voice breaking. "Should have known. Should have, Thaddeus." She said his name firmly this time, anchoring him back toward the room, toward the present, toward the hand that held his now. "You're not there anymore. You're here. I'm here." His grip loosened slightly. His breathing, ragged before, began to even out. "Augusta? Yes. Don't let go." "I won't," she said, and meant it more completely than she had meant almost anything in her life. "I'm not going anywhere." He slept after that. Finally, the fever beginning its slow retreat, and Augusta sat in the dark, holding the hand of a man who had just shown her, more honestly than any conversation ever could have, exactly what he had lost, and exactly how much it had cost him to keep living afterward. He did not remember the fever dream, or claimed not to. When he woke 3 days later with his fever broken, and his strength beginning its slow return. But something had shifted between them regardless. Augusta could feel it in the way he watched her now. Not the careful, measuring gaze of a man deciding whether to trust someone, but something steadier. Something that had already decided, somewhere in the depths of that fever, and simply hadn't found the words yet to say so, while fully awake. "You stayed," he said. The first morning he was strong enough to sit up and take broth without help. "Of course I stayed." Most wouldn't have. Hired help, especially. Could have sent for the doctor and kept your distance till it passed. "I'm not most," Augusta said. Simply something moved across his face. Gratitude, she thought, though it ran deeper than that word usually carried. "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not." The first snow came early that year, weeks before anyone expected it, and it came hard. Augusta had walked to the ranch that morning, under a sky the color of slate, the air carrying a metallic bite that should have warned her, except she'd lived in Montana less than a season and hadn't yet learned to read the particular silence that came before mountain weather turned. Dangerous. By midday, what had started as a light dusting had become a wall of white pressing against every window, the wind screaming around the corners of the house with a sound she'd never heard before and hoped never to hear again. "You're not walking back to town in this," Thaddeus said, standing at the window, his jaw tight in a way that told her this wasn't a suggestion. "I have to. Mrs. Pruitt will worry. Mrs. Pruitt will worry a great deal more if I let you walk 5 miles into a blizzard and you don't make it." He turned from the window and there was something fierce in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of protective urgency that startled her with its intensity. "I'll send word when the road's clear enough for the boy to carry a message. You're staying here tonight." Possibly longer. Augusta opened her mouth to argue, out of habit more than conviction, and found she didn't actually want to. The storm outside had a violence to it that made the prospect of 5 miles on foot feel less like inconvenience and more like genuine danger. "All right," she said. The storm raged for 3 full days. It was, Augusta would think later, the strangest and somehow gentlest 3 days of her life. To have confined to a house that had once felt too large for one grieving man, and now felt suddenly exactly the right size for 2 people, learning how to exist comfortably in close quarters. They took turns keeping the fire fed through nights that dropped colder than either of them had words for. Thaddeus taught her, out of necessity, how to read the particular sounds the house made under heavy wind, which creaks meant the roof was holding, and which would have meant trouble had they come. Augusta, in turn, found herself doing something she hadn't expected, telling him about Lowell. About her father's debts, her mother's quiet courage, the particular loneliness of growing up in a body the world had decided, before she'd done anything to earn the judgment, was somehow wrong, wiring higher. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, as though every word she gave him mattered enough to deserve his complete attention. "They sound like fools," he said finally, when she'd finished telling him about the deacon's wife and her nickel bet. "All of them. Every person in that town who ever made you feel like something was wrong with you for being strong. It didn't feel like foolishness. At the time, no," he agreed. "I imagine it felt like the whole world agreeing on something true." He was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "Took me a long time to learn that the whole world agreeing on something doesn't make it true, just makes it loud." On the second night, with the wind still howling and the supply running low enough that rationing had become a quiet, practical conversation between them, Augusta found him standing at the window again, watching snow pile against the glass in drifts higher than she'd ever seen. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Of the storm?" He shook his head slightly. "I've weathered worse out here." "The land teaches you not to fear what it can't help being." "Then what?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rougher than usual. "I'm frightened of how easy this has become," he said. "You. Here, this house feeling full instead of empty for the first time in 3 years. I keep waiting for it to feel like betrayal, and it doesn't. It just feels like breathing again after holding my breath a very long time." Augusta felt something tighten in her chest, equal parts hope and caution. That doesn't sound like something to be frightened of." "No," he admitted. "Maybe it isn't. Maybe I've just forgotten what it feels like to want something good without bracing for it to be taken away." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, both of them watching the storm rage against glass that held, solid and warm, between them and the killing cold outside. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, echoing, without meaning, to the same words she'd once given him in the dark of his fever, weeks before. Storm or no storm, he looked at her then, something unguarded crossing his face for the first time since she'd arrived. "I'm starting to believe that," he said. The roads cleared on the fourth morning, the world outside transformed into something blinding and white, and strangely peaceful, the violence of the previous days erased beneath a calm that felt almost like forgiveness. Augusta walked back to Mrs. Pruitt's that afternoon, the snow crunching beneath boots that had never once, in 3 days, felt the cold the way she expected them to. Because some part of her, she realized, had spent those 3 days warmer than she'd been in years, regardless of what the thermometer said. Mrs. Pruitt met her at the door with an expression that was trying very hard to look like simple relief, and not quite managing to hide something more knowing underneath it. 3 days, the older woman said, snowed in together. My, nothing happened, Mrs. Pruitt." "I didn't say it did, dear," a small satisfied smile. "But something's happening. I'd have to be blind not to see it." Augusta did not argue the point. Found, walking up to her small room above the kitchen, that she did not particularly want to. The days that followed the storm carried a different quality than the ones before it. Something had settled between them during those 3 snowed-in days, not dramatically, not with any single moment she could point to as the turning point, but gradually, the way frost gradually gives way to thaw. She found herself looking forward to the walk out to the ranch each morning, in a way she hadn't quite let herself admit before. Found herself noticing, with a small private pleasure she didn't examine too closely, the way Thaddeus had started leaving 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, as though the ritual had simply expanded to include the fact that she usually arrived not long after he poured it. Mrs. Pruitt, for her part, had taken to watching Augusta over breakfast with the particular knowing patience of a woman who had seen this exact transformation happen before in other people's lives and recognized the signs the way a farmer recognizes weather. She did not press, she did not tease, not directly. But there was a new gentleness in the way she handed Augusta her morning coffee, a softness around the eyes that suggested approval she wasn't yet ready to put into words. "You've got color in your cheeks these days," she observed. One morning, not looking up from her mending. "It's the cold," Augusta said. "The walk?" Mrs. Pruitt said, in the particular tone of a woman who didn't believe a word of it, and saw no need to argue the point. It was nearly 2 weeks later, the ground still carrying patches of that early snow, in the shadowed places where the sun couldn't reach, that she returned her attention fully to the ledgers and found something that had nothing to do with weather or warmth at all. It was a Tuesday. She would remember that later, the particular ordinariness of a Tuesday, when she found the second wound in his ledgers, not the chaos she'd already tamed. Something else, buried 3 years deep, in a column she'd balanced months ago and never thought to question again. Because balanced was balanced, and she had trusted her own work. Except a payment to the Bridger Gap Mercantile didn't match. $40, recorded twice, once in March, once again in April, same amount, same vendor, no corresponding delivery noted anywhere in his crates of receipts. She sat with it for a long moment, pen still, mind working. Because $40 wasn't nothing. $40, paid twice for goods that arrived once, meant someone had been skimming off a grieving man, too distracted to check his own books. Which meant someone in this town had been stealing from Thaddeus Corrigan for longer than she wanted to think about. She went back through the drawer, methodically. The way her father had taught her, before he taught her anything else. Find the first lie, then look for its siblings. She found 4 more, spread across 2 years, small enough individually to escape notice, large enough together to matter. Her hands were not quite steady when she finally set the pen down. She found him on the porch that evening, sharpening a blade he didn't need sharpened, the way he did when his hands needed something to do, and his mind was somewhere else entirely. "Thaddeus," he looked up. Something in her voice must have carried, because he set the blade down without finishing the stroke. "What is it?" Not a question. A bracing. The mercantile has been overcharging you for 2 years. Maybe longer." He went very still. "How much?" $190. "That I've found so far." The number landed in the space between them like a stone dropped down a well. She could hear it falling, could feel the long silence before it hit bottom. "Sawyer," he said finally. "Flat. Runs the mercantile. You know him?" "Known him 15 years. A muscle worked in his jaw. Buried his wife the same winter I buried." He stopped, cut the sentence clean in half. The way a man cuts a rope before it can pull him somewhere he doesn't want to go. Augusta did not finish it for him, did not ask. Had learned, in 2 months under this roof, exactly how much weight that unfinished sentence carried, and exactly how little good it would do to force it into the open, before he was ready to set it down himself. "I could be wrong," she said instead, gently, offering him a door if he needed one. "I'd want to look again, before either of us says a word to anyone. You're not wrong." His voice had gone rough. "You haven't been wrong about a single column since you sat down at that desk." It wasn't quite a compliment. It was something steadier than that, the particular respect of a man who had learned, slowly and against his own habits, to trust someone else's eyes more than his own. "Then we go to him," she said. "Together." With the numbers, he looked at her for a long moment. The porch light catching the lines around his eyes, the gray just starting at his temples, that she'd never quite let herself notice before. "You'd do that," he said. Not a question this time either. More like a man confirming a fact he'd already started to believe. "I came out here to make sense of your books, Mr. Corrigan." She held his gaze. "I intend to finish the job." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Gone before it fully arrived, but she'd seen it. Filed it away, the way she filed everything else worth keeping. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter than Augusta had braced herself. For Sawyer was an older man, soft around the middle, the kind of face built for looking harmless. He went pale when Thaddeus laid the ledger pages on his counter. 5 entries, circled in Augusta's careful hand, dates and amounts lined up like evidence in a courtroom. Now Thaddeus, don't. One word. Flat as a closed door. The numbers don't lie, Sawyer. Even when you do, it was... Augusta realized with a small jolt the exact words she'd said to him weeks ago. He'd kept them, carried them out of that kitchen and into this confrontation like a tool he'd been sharpening ever since. Sawyer's eyes flicked to Augusta. The old familiar assessment. Too tall, too broad. What is she doing standing in a man's business like this? And for just a moment, the shame she'd carried her whole life rose up hot in her throat. Then, Thaddeus spoke again, before the silence could settle into something that might let Sawyer feel safe. She found what I couldn't see in 3 years of trying. His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. You'll make it right. Every dollar. Or I take this to the circuit judge next month, and you can explain the dates to him instead of me. Sawyer made it right. Counted out the money on the counter with hands that shook slightly, would not meet Augusta's eyes again. And Augusta found, walking out of that store with Thaddeus beside her, that she did not need him to. She had not needed anyone's eyes to confirm what she already knew about her own worth, not for a long time now. Not since a tin cup of coffee had taught her otherwise. The story moved through Bridger Gap the way stories always did in small towns, fast, reshaped a little with every telling. Until by the time it reached the far end of Main Street, it had become something closer to legend than fact. Augusta heard a version of it herself, 2 days later, while waiting outside the post office for Mrs. Pruitt to finish with another customer. 2 women near the corner, voices not quite as hushed as they thought, caught Sawyer red-handed, they say. That Pell girl, with her head for figures, Corrigan's bookkeeper, heard she found it sitting right there in his ledgers, clear as day, while half the town walked past that store every week and never thought twice. Sharp woman, that one. It was such a small thing, 2 strangers, speaking of her without the cruelty she'd braced herself for out of long habit. Speaking of her, instead, like someone whose presence in this town had become, in the space of a few months, something other than a curiosity to whisper about. Sharp woman, not big woman, not strange woman, the giant from back east who came off the train for Corrigan's ranch, Sharp. Augusta carried the word home with her that evening, turning it over the whole walk back, and found that for the first time since stepping off that train, the things people whispered about her in town had stopped being able to touch the parts of herself she'd worked hardest to protect. That night, walking the road back toward the ranch, in the long gold light of early evening, Thaddeus said something he had never said before. My father would have liked you. Augusta nearly stumbled over nothing at all. I never knew him, doesn't matter. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the way he did when a thing cost him something to say. He used to tell me, find a partner who sees what you can't, not someone to lean on. Someone to stand beside. He paused. Took me a long time to understand what he meant by that. Augusta said nothing. Could not have said anything. Not with her throat gone tight and her chest doing something complicated and unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to the hope she'd promised herself she wouldn't let in so soon. But she let herself, just for the length of that walk, imagine what it might mean to be a person someone stood beside instead of leaned on. It was, she thought, the first time in her life that being strong had sounded like a gift instead of an apology. The spare room sat at the end of the hall, door closed, the way it had been closed since the day she'd first noticed it without understanding why. Augusta thought about it more than she let herself admit. Thought about the cradle inside, about the chisel set down mid-stroke years ago and never picked back up, about a grief so large a man had simply shut a door on it rather than finish what his own hands had started. She did not go back inside, not again. That would have been a trespass. She wasn't owed the right to make twice. But she began slowly to notice the dust gathering on the outside of that door. The way it had become, without either of them naming it, a kind of monument. A room frozen at the exact moment grief had stopped him cold, and she began to wonder, carefully. The way she wondered about anything, she wasn't sure she had permission to want. Whether a house could go on holding its breath forever. Whether some rooms needed, eventually someone brave enough to open the window. It was Mrs. Pruitt who finally said the words no one else had dared to. Augusta had come into town for thread again. A smaller errand this time, less fraught, the sting of that first humiliating trip having dulled with weeks of better days layered over it. She found Mrs. Pruitt at her usual post, behind the post office counter, sorting mail with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considered gossip a civic duty. "You've put color back in that house," Mrs. Pruitt said, not looking up from the letters in her hands. "Folks have noticed. I've only fixed his ledgers." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes lifted then, sharp and knowing. "Is that all you've fixed, dear?" Augusta felt heat climb her neck. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." The older woman set the mail down, folded her hands, and regarded Augusta with the particular directness of someone who had buried enough secrets of her own to recognize one forming in someone else. Thaddeus Corrigan buried his wife 3 years ago this autumn. Buried the child with her, not but a day old. He has not so much as looked at another woman since. Not once. Not until you stepped off that train. The words landed exactly where Augusta had feared they might. "I know about the cradle," Augusta said quietly. Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose. "Then you know more than most of this town does. He doesn't speak of it." "Not to anyone. I didn't mean to find it. I wasn't looking, I imagine not," Mrs. Pruitt's voice gentled. "But you found it, and you stayed anyway. That tells a body something, doesn't it?" Augusta did not answer, could not, with her throat gone tight again, and her mind already racing ahead to questions she hadn't let herself ask outright. What had his wife looked like? Whether she'd been small, the way the world preferred its women small. Whether Augusta, standing here too tall and too broad in every room she entered, was anything at all like the woman he'd lost. Or whether that was precisely the wrong question to be asking. Her name was Sarah, Mrs. Pruitt said, as though she'd heard the question anyway. Sweet girl, frail, even before the baby came. The midwife said the cold got into her lungs that winter and never let go. A pause. "She wasn't built the way you're built, dear. Wasn't built for hard winters or hard work. I expect that's no small part of why Thaddeus watches you the way he does." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes went distant for a moment. The way eyes do when they're seeing something years in the past rather than the present in front of them. "I remember the night the baby came," she said quietly. "Bitter cold, even for January. Thaddeus rode 5 miles in a storm to fetch the midwife, and by the time they got back, it was already too late for one of them, and not long after that, too late for the other. He buried them together. Sarah holding the babe, the way she'd held him those few hours, he lived. Augusta's hand found the back of a chair, needing something solid to hold. He built that cradle with his own hands. That autumn, Mrs. Pruitt went on. Started it the week he found out Sarah was carrying. Was halfway finished with the carving the night they died. Never picked the chisel back up. Couldn't bring himself to finish it, and couldn't bring himself to throw it out either. So, it just sits there, same as it's for 3 years. "Why are you telling me this?" Augusta asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone should." Mrs. Pruitt's gaze was steady, kind, the directness of a woman who had decided some truths mattered more than tact. "Because you've a right to know what you're walking into, if you mean to walk into it at all, and because I think, though it isn't my place to say so, that you might be exactly what that house has been waiting 3 years to let back in." Augusta turned the words over slowly. Felt them settle somewhere unexpected, not as comfort, exactly. Not yet, but as the first real proof that the qualities the world had spent 23 years teaching her to apologize for might be, to one particular man, the very thing he'd learned the hard way to need. She thought about the spare room, the entire walk back to the ranch, thought about a door kept closed for 3 years. A chisel set down mid-stroke. A chasm of grief a man had built a wall around, rather than learn to cross. She thought about her own father, the silent years after her mother died. How a house could go on, holding its breath, long after the person grieving had stopped noticing they were doing it. By the time she reached the ranch, she had made a decision that frightened her slightly, with its own boldness. She did not ask permission. Some things she had learned watching Thaddeus these past months could not be asked for. They had to be offered, plainly, and left for the other person to accept or refuse on their own terms. She found him mending tack in the barn and said it plainly, the way he said things himself. "I want to use the spare room." He went very still. The leather strap in his hands forgotten. For what? "My desk has outgrown the corner you gave me. I need more space for the new accounts. Now that we're tracking the herd properly instead of guessing at it." She kept her voice level, practical. The way she'd learned spoke to him most clearly. "I'd clear it myself. Move nothing you didn't want moved. Build shelves where there's room. Augusta." Her name came out rough. "You know what's in there." "I do." "Then you know why I can't." "I'm not asking you to forget her," Augusta said gently, but without flinching. "I'm asking whether a room can hold a memory and still be useful for something else. Whether grief has to mean a door stays shut forever, or whether it can just mean a door that opens carefully when someone's ready." He did not answer for a long moment. The barn around them creaked in the wind, the horses shifting in their stalls, and Augusta waited, the way she had learned to wait with this particular man, patiently, without pressing, leaving the door open rather than forcing it. "The cradle stays," he said finally, voice thick, "wherever you put it. It stays, of course, and I want to be there. When you move things." "I don't." He stopped, started again. "I don't think I can let someone else touch it without me there. Then we'll do it together," Augusta said. "Whenever you're ready." He was ready, as it turned out 3 days later, a Sunday afternoon, the light coming in soft and gold, through the room's single window for the first time in years, because Augusta had pulled back the curtains the moment they walked in. They worked mostly in silence. Augusta cleared dust, moved crates, found a corner for a desk that would catch the morning light the same way the kitchen window did. Thaddeus, for his part, did one thing only, lifted the cradle with hands that shook slightly and carried it himself to a corner near the window where the light would reach it. He did not finish the carving that day, did not pick up the chisel at all. But he set the cradle where the sun could find it, instead of leaving it in the dark where grief had kept it hidden for 3 years. And Augusta understood that this, too, was its own kind of beginning. Reuben Castor's letter arrived on a Thursday. Augusta did not recognize the hand at first. Had nearly set it aside with the rest of the week's mail before something familiar in the looping signature caught her eye and stopped her cold. She had not written to him, had not so much as thought his name in weeks, had let the cousin's letter about the Ainsley girl fade into the same drawer where she kept everything else too painful to examine twice. So why now? Why this? She opened it standing in Mrs. Pruitt's front hall. Because some letters could not wait for privacy. Because the dread in her chest had already started climbing before her eyes reached the first line. "Augusta, I have heard, through more than one source, that you have found yourself a situation out west. I confess I did not expect it of you. I write now because I find myself, in honesty, regretting the manner of our parting. The Ainsley girl and I did not suit after all. I find myself thinking of you more than I expected to. Perhaps, if circumstances allow, we might correspond again. Reuben." The page shook slightly in her hand, not from longing, from something closer to fury. Cold and sudden, rising up through a wound she had thought, foolishly, might finally be starting to close, because he had not written to apologize. He had written because the Ainsley girl hadn't worked out, because he was, even now, treating her like a door he could knock on again whenever his other options ran dry, which meant every word he'd ever said to her. The ribbon, the Sunday walks, The low voice telling her he didn't mind that she was tall had been exactly as cheap as she'd feared. The night he stood up at the harvest social and made her humiliation into entertainment. She had built 6 months of hope on a man who measured her worth against whoever else happened to be available. The old shame rose up fast and ugly. The voice she thought she'd quit these past 2 months. Too much, too tall, too broad. Not the kind of woman a man chooses first. She stood very still in Mrs. Pruitt's front hall and let herself for one terrible moment believe it again. She walked back to the ranch that afternoon in a daze, the letter folded small and hard in her fist, and found that the 5 miles passed without her noticing a single mile marker. Her mind too busy, too loud, because what if he was right? What if every gentle word Thaddeus had offered these past months? The coffee, the bird, the porch and the fence post, and the way he'd looked at her on that platform. What if all of it was simply convenience? A widower with no one else nearby, settling for whoever happened to step off the train. She hated the thought the moment it formed. Hated herself a little for letting Reuben Castor reach across 3 states and plant doubt in a life that had, until this afternoon, felt entirely her own to build. Except doubt, once planted, did not uproot easily. She knew that from years of practice, so she said nothing, folded the letter smaller, tucked it into her pocket and let it sit there, against her hip, a small hard weight she carried through supper and through the evening, and into the long sleepless hours, after, turning Reuben's words over and over until they'd lost all shape and meaning except the old familiar one. Too much, too tall, too broad. She did not tell Thaddeus. Told herself it wasn't his business. Told herself a letter from a man 3 states away had nothing to do with the careful, fragile thing growing between them at the ranch, except it had everything to do with it. Because every time he looked at her now, really looked, the way he'd been looking more and more these past weeks, some small, cruel part of her had started asking why. Why now? Why her, when no one else in 23 years had managed to look at her that way without it turning, eventually, into a joke or an apology? She carried Reuben's letter, folded in her pocket for 3 days, unable to burn it, unable to answer it, unable to do anything, but let it sit there like a stone against her hip. On the 3rd evening, Thaddeus noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, even the things she worked hardest to hide. "You've gone quiet," he said, over supper, watching her push food around a plate she hadn't touched. "I'm tired." "You're not tired. You're somewhere else." She set down her fork. Looked at him, across the table his father had built, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not want to lie to this particular man, not even to protect herself. "I had a letter," she said, "from someone I knew back east." His face didn't change. But something in his stillness sharpened, the way a man's stillness sharpens when he's bracing for news he doesn't want. "The one who left you waiting." It wasn't a question. She hadn't told him the full shape of that story, not the harvest social, not the barn door joke, not 11 months of hope built on ribbon and lies. But he'd clearly understood enough, somewhere along the way, to know there was a wound underneath the silence. "He wants to write again," she said. Now that his other arrangement didn't suit him, something moved across Thaddeus's face then. Quick, hard to name. Not jealousy, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to the particular anger of a man who has learned, the hard way, what it costs to lose someone, and would not wish that lesson on anyone him to care for. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. Augusta." Her name, in his mouth, still landed somewhere unguarded in her chest every time. "You don't owe a man like that the courtesy of an answer. I know that. Do you?" The question hung there, sharper than she'd expected from him. And she understood, watching the muscle work in his jaw, that some part of this conversation wasn't entirely about Reuben Castor at all. That some part of it was about a man who'd spent 3 years assuming he didn't deserve a second chance at anything. Watching the woman across from him hesitate over whether she deserved better than a coward who'd already proven what he was. "I know," she said again, steadier this time. "I burned the first one I wrote back. Couldn't find the words that didn't sound like begging." "Good. I'm not finished." That stopped him. Augusta reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded letter, 3 days soft from handling, and set it on the table between them like evidence in a case she'd already decided. "I mean, I know exactly what I want to say to him now, Shin," she said. "And it isn't going to sound like begging at all." She wrote the letter that night, alone in her room, by the light of a single candle that burned down nearly to its base. Before she finished, "Reuben, you write as though I have been waiting. I have not. I have been building a life 3 states away from the room, where you decided, in front of everyone I knew, that my body made me unworthy of your choosing. I have found a place in that life where my size is not an apology I owe anyone, where the work of my hands is wanted, not endured, where a man twice your courage looked at me on an empty platform and did not flinch. Asterisk. You did not write to make amends. You wrote because your second choice did not hold, and you remembered conveniently that I once made myself small enough to want you. I am done making myself small for anyone. Asterisk. Do not write again. Augusta." She sealed it before she could read it a second time and talk herself into softening a single word. The morning she posted it, the sky over Bridger Gap was doing something it rarely did, clouding heavy and fast from the west. The kind of sudden mountain weather that old-timers learned to read before it learned to surprise them. Thaddeus met her on the road, back from town, riding out to find her the way he sometimes did when the weather turned, and pulled up alongside her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that had been working its way loose for weeks, and had finally, in this particular gray morning light, found its way to the surface. "You posted it," he said. "I did." Every word. He was quiet for a moment, the horse shifting beneath him, the first cold drops of rain beginning to fall around them both. "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing someone you'd built a whole life around," he said. "Spent 3 years certain of it." He looked at her then. Really looked the way he had on that platform months ago, except there was nothing careful or measuring in it now. Only something steady. "I was wrong," he said. "The worst thing is watching someone good as you spend her whole life, believing she's too much for anyone to choose. And almost letting a man like that convince you of it twice." Augusta felt the rain start to soak through her shoulders, did not move to shelter from it. "I'm not convinced of it anymore," she said. "I know. I watched you write the letter that proved it." They stood there a moment longer, rain coming harder now, and Augusta understood. With a clarity that frightened her less than it once would have. That something had shifted between them that could not be unshifted. "We should get out of this rain," she said. "Should." He agreed. Neither of them moved for another long moment. Then, finally, they did, riding and walking together back toward the ranch, through a downpour that left them, both soaked through and laughing, for the first time, at something that wasn't sad at all. The weeks that followed carried a quality Augusta had never quite experienced before. Not the careful holding pattern of early courtship, but something steadier. A kind of quiet certainty that had crept in gradually, the way morning light fills a room, without anyone noticing the exact moment darkness became day. Thaddeus began speaking of Sarah more often now, in small unburdened pieces. The way a man speaks of someone he has finally stopped needing to protect with silence. He told her of the way Sarah used to hum while she worked, off-key and unself-conscious. Of her fierce stubbornness about planting flowers in soil, better suited to nothing but sagebrush. Augusta listened to all of it without flinching, without the small jealous ache she might once have expected from herself. Because she understood, somewhere in those weeks, that loving a man who had loved deeply before her was not a competition she needed to win. It was simply proof that he knew how to love at all. There was a stretch of road, not far from where Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, gave way to open country, where a small cemetery sat behind a low wrought iron fence, half hidden by cottonwoods. Augusta had passed it a dozen times without thinking much of it. It was Thaddeus, riding beside her one gray afternoon, who slowed his horse without explanation and turned in through the gate. She followed without asking why. He led her to a stone near the back, beneath the largest of the cottonwoods, simple and unadorned. Sarah Corrigan, beloved wife, and infant son held but a single day, Augusta stood beside him in silence, letting the wind move through the leaves above them. "I haven't been out here in months," he said finally. "Told myself I was too busy for it, but truth is, I think I was afraid of what it meant that I wasn't grieving the same way anymore." "Grief doesn't stay the same shape forever," Augusta said quietly. "I loved her," he said. "I want you to know that, plainly. I grieved her the only way I knew how, which was mostly by closing doors and letting silence do the work I didn't have words for. I know, and I think I'm ready to stop only closing doors." Augusta felt something rise in her chest, equal parts hope and caution. "That's not a thing you owe me an answer to today," she said gently. "I know," he said, looking at her with something steadier in his face than she'd seen there before. "But I wanted you to know where I stand. Before I show you what I mean to show you tonight." The storm broke fully that night. Hard rain against the roof, wind finding every gap in the old log walls. They sat by the fire afterward, dried and quiet. "Augusta, I want to show you something." She looked up, startled by the tension in his voice. He stood, walked down the hall, toward the room they had cleared together weeks before, and Augusta followed, heart climbing into her throat. He stopped beside the cradle, knelt, and from a small cloth-wrapped bundle tucked beneath it, he withdrew the chisel that had sat untouched on that floor for 3 years. "I started this again," he said, voice rough. "2 nights ago, after everything that's happened. Sawyer, the night you stayed up with me through that fever, your voice telling me you weren't going anywhere." He held the chisel out, simply to show her the small, careful new marks along the cradle's bare side. "I'm not finishing it for her," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm finishing it because I think, for the first time in 3 years, I might actually have a reason to." Augusta knelt beside him on the floor of that room, the rain still hammering the roof above them, and reached out to touch the new carving marks with the same careful reverence she'd once touched the wooden bird he'd given her months before. "I'm not going anywhere," she said again, the same words she'd given him in the dark of his fever, except this time both of them were fully awake to hear them. He looked at her then. Really looked, every trace of caution finally fully fallen away. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to believe that's true." Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that small room, lit now by firelight instead of dust and shadow, something had finally quietly begun to heal. She did not return to Mrs. Pruitt's that night. She simply fell asleep in the chair beside the cradle, and Thaddeus did not wake her. Only brought a blanket from his own room and laid it over her shoulders before banking the fire for the night. She woke before dawn to find him still there, asleep in the chair across from her, the chisel resting loosely in his open hand. For a long moment, Augusta simply watched him. She thought of Rubenster's letter, still folded in the bottom of her trunk, and found that for the first time since reading it, the old words had lost almost all their power to wound her. Too much, too tall, too broad. Let him keep his small words. She had found, in a house at the edge of the mountains, a man who measured her by an entirely different scale, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she measured up exactly as she was. The cradle took 3 more weeks to finish. Augusta watched it happen in pieces, the way she watched everything about this man now. Patiently, without rushing him. Some evenings he carved for an hour. Other evenings he didn't touch it at all, just sat beside it with the chisel idle in his hand. She never asked him to hurry, but something had shifted in her too these past weeks. Because watching him finish that cradle One careful cut at a time, she had started to notice a small and uncomfortable truth about herself. She had spent so many years being grateful. Grateful for a tin cup of coffee left without a note. Grateful for a wooden bird. Grateful, even, for a job that gave her purpose and a roof that didn't ask anything of her except honest work. Gratitude had become, somewhere along the way, the only language she let herself speak. Except gratitude wasn't the same as partnership, and she was beginning to understand that if this was going to become something real, she could not simply wait, grateful and patient, for him to decide when he was ready. She had to ask for what she actually wanted. She walked into town, the week before that conversation, ostensibly for thread, though she had begun to suspect that errands to town had become her excuse for thinking, rather than her reason for going. Mrs. Pruitt caught the look on her face the moment she stepped through the door. "You've got the look of a woman deciding something," the older woman said. "I'm going to ask him to choose me, plainly, not let him drift toward it in his own time." Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose, then settled into something that looked almost like pride. "Good," she said simply. "That man has spent 3 years letting grief make all his decisions for him. Somebody ought to make him decide something else for a change." Augusta carried those words home with her, turning them over the whole 5 miles, and found that for once, she let herself believe them without immediately searching for the catch. The conversation happened on a morning in late autumn, frost silvering the grass outside the kitchen window. The cradle finished now and sitting in its corner like a promise neither of them had fully spoken aloud. She found him at the kitchen table, ledgers spread in front of him. "Thaddeus, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you answer." "All right," she took a breath, steadied herself the way she'd once steadied herself on an empty train platform waiting for a man who never came. "I am not a woman who needs rescuing," she said. "I came to this house because I had nowhere else to go, and you gave me work and shelter, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die. But I am done being grateful in place of being chosen." His jaw tightened slightly. He said nothing the way she'd asked. "I watched you finish that cradle one careful cut at a time," she went on. "But I won't be a woman who waits quietly at the edge of someone else's healing, hoping she eventually gets included in it. If you want me, in this house, really want me, not as a kindness, not as a convenience, then I need you to say so, plainly." The way you say everything else, silence stretched between them, long enough that Augusta's heart began climbing toward her throat. Then Thaddeus stood, walked around the table, and knelt, not romantically, not with any flourish at all, simply knelt the way a man kneels when he wants to look someone directly in the eye, instead of down at them. "You're right," he said. "I've been letting silence speak for me my whole life. I won't let it speak for this too." He took her hand, held it the way he'd held it once before in the dark of a fever, except now his grip was steady, certain. "Fully present, I want you," he said. "Not as a kindness. I want you because you walked into the wreckage of my life and didn't flinch from any of it. I want you because you're the only person who's looked at the size of me and the size of you and seen, instead of two oddities, two people finally built to stand on equal ground." "That's not a proposal," she said, voice unsteady. "Is it? No. I'm saving that. I just needed you to know, before I ask it properly, exactly what kind of man is doing the asking." The third evening came clear and cold, stars sharp against a sky scrubbed clean by an earlier rain. Augusta walked to the ranch that afternoon with her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She found him on the porch, waiting. "Come inside," was all he said. "I have something to show you." He led her down the hall to the spare room and set the completed cradle on the floor between them. "I finished it for our children," he said quietly. "Yours and mine, whoever they turn out to be. Not to replace what I lost, to make room for what I hope to have." He reached into his coat then and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth, not a ring but a tin cup, the very one he'd left coffee in every morning for months. polished now until it shone. "I don't have much to offer you that isn't already yours," he said. "All I have left to give you is a promise that I'll stand beside you, instead of in front of you, the way my father told me a partner should be treated." He held the cup out to her. "Augusta Pell, will you marry me? Not because you have nowhere else to go. Because I have nowhere I'd rather be than wherever you are." Augusta took the cup with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Yes," she said. "I was hoping you'd finally find the words. Took me long enough." "You're a man who speaks in actions," she said, smiling now, fully and without apology. "I should have known the words would come slowest of all." They married in late winter, in the small clapboard church at Bridger Gap. With snow still patched, in the shadowed places where the sun couldn't reach, Mrs. Pruitt stood as Augusta's witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was only there because of the cold. The whole town turned out. The same town that had once whispered about a bigger door, now filling the pews to watch a wedding they'd somehow come to consider their own. Augusta wore a simple gray dress, the same color as the one she'd worn stepping off that train, except this one had been sewn with her own two capable hands and fit her exactly as she was. When it came time for vows, Thaddeus spoke first, his voice carrying clear through the small church. "I, Thaddeus, take you, Augusta, not as someone to fill an empty space, but as someone to build a full one alongside. I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you, for as long as we both shall live. I, Augusta, take you, Thaddeus." Having learned the hard way, the difference between a man who wants me small enough to manage and a man who wants me exactly as I am. I promise this not out of gratitude, but out of choice. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the silence that followed felt, to Augusta, like the loudest kind of acceptance a room full of people could offer. The celebration afterward spilled out onto the church lawn. Even Sawyer approached them near the end of the evening, hat in hand. "Wish you both happiness," he said, not quite meeting Augusta's eyes. "Whatever else passed between us, you were fair about it. Didn't ruin me when you could have." "We none of us are only our worst moment, Mr. Sawyer," Augusta said. "I hope you've found better dealing since." Later, as the celebration wound toward evening, Thaddeus pulled her aside, to the quiet edge of the churchyard. "I keep waiting to feel like I'm betraying something," he admitted quietly. "Keep bracing for the guilt to catch up with the happiness, and has it?" "No," he said finally, something like wonder in his voice. "It hasn't. I think maybe it isn't going to." "Good," Augusta said simply. "Sarah would want that for you. I believe that, even though I never knew her. But the story did not end there. Not entirely. 3 months into their marriage, a letter arrived from a lawyer in Helena, representing a man named Higgins, who claimed a parcel of land bordering Thaddeus's ranch. Land that included the very creek that watered half his herd. Higgins rode out himself a few weeks later, his manner carrying the particular blustering confidence of a man who knew his position was weaker than his voice suggested. He made a remark about Augusta's size that landed exactly where he'd aimed it, the old cruelty surfacing again as cruelty always did. Sooner or later, from men who'd never learned a better language, Augusta did not answer him with words. She simply held his gaze until he looked away first. Something, she suspected, didn't happen to Higgins very often. The dispute dragged through the spring. Augusta spent 3 weeks combing through her father-in-law's old papers in the attic, the work reminding her, in its careful tedium, of the very first ledgers she'd untangled in this house. She found false leads first. Then, in the bottom of a trunk that had belonged to Thaddeus's grandfather, she found an original survey, dated a full decade before Higgins's claimed boundary line, placing the creek squarely on Corrigan land with a margin no honest court could dispute. She presented it to the circuit judge herself, standing beside Thaddeus in a courtroom that had, 20 years earlier, likely never expected to see a woman of her size and confidence speaking on matters of property law. The judge ruled in less than an hour. Walking out of that courthouse, Thaddeus's hand found hers. "I'd have lost that land without you. You'd have found another way." "No," he said, plain as he always was. "Some battles need a partner who sees what you can't. I didn't fully believe it myself until I watched you win one for me." The years that followed unfolded the way good years do, quietly, mostly, the kind of contentment that doesn't make for dramatic stories but makes for a good life all the same. Augusta kept the ranch books, expanding the operation steadily as Thaddeus's herd grew and his reputation for fair dealing spread through the territory. She started, in the third year, a small side venture of her own, buying and reselling cattle at auction, using the same sharp eye for numbers that had once tamed his chaos into order, until the Corrigan name became known throughout the valley for honest weights and honest measures. The auction work suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She found, standing in stockyards full of ranchers twice her age, that her size, once a source of constant apology, had become, in this particular arena, an asset no one questioned. Buyers trusted a woman who could heft a sample bale of hay onto a scale without assistance, who spoke of cattle weights and grazing yields with the same precise confidence she'd once brought to Thaddeus's ledgers. "You've a gift for this," one old rancher told her, after she'd negotiated a fair price on a herd he'd nearly sold short. "Wish my own wife had half your head for numbers, she might," Augusta said. If anyone ever bothered to ask her, the town of Bridger Gap, which had once whispered about a bigger door, learned over time to speak of Augusta Corrigan the way Mrs. Pruitt had first taught it to, as a sharp woman, a capable woman, a woman whose size had never once, in 5 years of marriage, kept her from doing anything she set her mind to. Their first child came in the second year, a daughter born in autumn, with her father's dark hair and her mother's height already showing in the long, sturdy length of her at birth. The labor was long and difficult, the way Augusta's body did most things, thoroughly without rushing. Thaddeus paced the porch outside for 14 hours, unable to sit still, remembering, with a fear he didn't speak aloud until much later, exactly how the last birth in this house had ended. When the midwife finally called him in, his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the daughter placed in his arms. "She's perfect," he said, voice breaking. "Augusta, she's perfect." "Of course she is," Augusta said, exhausted and radiant in the bed, where, 3 years earlier, a different woman's grief had once lived behind a closed door. "Look who built her. They named her Sarah, after the woman whose cradle she now slept in. The carved lupine and Indian paintbrush, worn smooth in places where small hands had already learned to reach for them." Augusta had worried, the first time she held her daughter, whether naming her, after Thaddeus's first love, would feel like living in a shadow. It didn't. Thaddeus made sure of that, the very first night, holding his newborn daughter and weeping in a way Augusta had never seen from him before. Not grief, but something closer to the particular relief of a man who had finally, fully, let go of believing happiness required him to forget what came before it. "She'd have liked this," he said quietly. "Sarah would have liked knowing some piece of her name went on to a life this happy." A second child followed 2 years later, a son broad through the shoulder even as an infant. They named him Joseph, after Thaddeus's father, the man who had built this house and this table and, in his own way, the foundation of everything that had eventually grown to hold Augusta safely within it. The winter following Joseph's birth brought a different kind of test. Not dramatic, not the stuff of legend, but the particular grinding difficulty of a season that simply refused to ease. Cattle prices fell sharply that year, and Thaddeus came in from a trip to the stockyards in Helena with a face Augusta hadn't seen since the early days of their marriage. "It's bad," he admitted that night after the children were asleep. "If prices don't recover by spring, we'll be looking at a hard choice about the herd." Augusta did not panic. "Then we plan for it," she said. "You buried a wife and child and kept this ranch standing through 3 years of grief alone. I crossed half a country with nothing but a trunk and a stranger's promise. We've both survived worse than numbers on a page. We'll survive this too. They spent that winter working harder than either had worked since the early months of their marriage. Prices recovered by the following autumn. The herd stronger than before. We did that together, she told Thaddeus the first warm evening of spring. We did, he agreed. I don't think I could have managed it alone. Not the way I managed everything before you. You wouldn't have had to manage it alone, Augusta said. That was rather the point of marrying me, wasn't it? He laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she'd learned to treasure, precisely because it had been so rare in those first careful months. Both children grew, in the years that followed, without the slightest understanding that their parents' size had ever been considered anything but ordinary. Sarah, by 4, could already lift a feed bucket that surprised the hired hands. Joseph, learning to walk, toppled chairs with a sturdiness that made Thaddeus laugh instead of worry. They'll never know what it cost us, Augusta said once, watching the children play in the yard. Never know what it took to get here. Maybe that's the gift, Thaddeus said. Building something so solid, the next ones born into it never have to fight for it the way we did. There was an afternoon when Sarah was barely past her 3rd birthday, when Augusta found her daughter crying quietly behind the barn, having overheard an older child from town remark, carelessly, that Sarah was built funny, like her mama. Augusta knelt beside her daughter and gathered her close. You are exactly as you should be, she said simply. The words plain enough for a child of 3 to carry even without fully understanding them yet. Built strong, like your mama and your papa. That's nothing to cry about, sweetheart. That's something to be proud of. She held her daughter a moment longer, feeling the same sturdy strength in that small body that she'd carried her whole life, and made herself a quiet promise. Kneeling there in the dust behind the barn, the way she'd once knelt on a train platform, with nothing but a trunk and a stranger's letter. That when Sarah was old enough to carry the fuller weight of it, she would hear the whole story. Not today, but someday, before the world had a chance to plant that old lie too deep to pull out, the lie that being too much was the same thing as being unworthy of being met. She would tell her about a man named Reuben Castor, and a room full of laughter, and a town that had taught her, over and over, that a strong woman was a problem to be managed, rather than a gift to be chosen. And she would tell her, too, about a stranger on a dark platform who had looked at her and not flinched, and a tin cup of coffee left without a note, and a chisel picked back up after 3 years of silence. She would tell her that the people who mocked what they didn't understand were usually the ones too small in spirit to understand much of anything at all, that Sarah's size, like her mother's, had been the problem. Their narrowness was, that she had always been, exactly as she was, enough. But that afternoon, holding her daughter close behind the barn, Augusta planted only the first small seed of it, and let the rest wait for its own season, the way grief had waited for Thaddeus and hope had waited for her. Bridger Gap had a way of forgetting its old cruelties once it had something better to talk about. By the time Sarah and Joseph were old enough to attend the small schoolhouse in town, no one remembered or chose to remember the whispers that had once followed their mother down Main Street. They remembered instead a family known throughout the valley for fairness, for sharp dealing, for a marriage that had somehow, against every old assumption about who deserved happiness and who didn't, become the standard other young couples measured their own hopes against. A letter arrived from Lowell in the 4th year of her marriage, the same cousin who had once written, carelessly, of Reuben Castor and the Ainsley girl. Augusta nearly set it aside unread, old habit rising before she could stop it. She read it anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah napping in the next room, and Joseph cooing in his cradle nearby, and found that the letter held nothing to fear at all. Augusta. Did you know Reuben Castor never did marry? Word is, he's grown stout and bitter, still telling the story of the woman he turned down at the harvest social. Though I notice he leaves out the part where the whole town laughed at his joke, and not one soul has laughed with him since about anything at all. I hope you're happy, cousin. From everything I hear, it sounds as though you've found exactly what this town never had the sense to offer you. Augusta set the letter down and sat for a long moment in the autumn light, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't quite expected. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to simple, complete relief that the chapter of her life spent shrinking herself for other people's comfort had finally fully closed. That evening, she told Thaddeus about the letter over supper. Stout and bitter, he repeated, almost laughing. Seems fitting somehow. I don't feel any triumph over it, Augusta said. I thought I might. I don't. No, Thaddeus agreed. When you've built something this good, there's not much room left for triumph over someone else's misery. Just gratitude that you didn't end up living it instead. 5 years to the day after, Augusta first stepped off that train onto an empty platform. She stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, watching morning sun pour through the glass, exactly the way Thaddeus's letter had once promised it would. The kitchen window faces east. You'll have the morning sun for your bread. The sun came exactly as promised. Poured golden across the kitchen table where a loaf of bread was rising. Across the floor where her daughter Sarah, now 3, sat arranging smooth river stones into careful, deliberate lines. Across the doorway where her son toddled after a chicken with the same fierce gap-toothed joy his father must have carried at that age. Thaddeus came in. From the morning chores, the smell of hay and cold air clinging to him, and paused in the doorway the way he still did sometimes, just to watch her standing there in the light. Still can't quite believe it, he said. Some mornings. Believe what? That a man could be foolish enough to lose 3 years grieving a closed door, when all he needed to do was open a window instead. Augusta crossed the kitchen and took his hand, work ruined and steady, exactly as it had been the first night he'd offered it to lift her trunk onto a borrowed mule. You weren't foolish, she said. You were grieving. There's no foolishness in that, only time and the slow work of healing it takes. And you, he said, 23 years old, alone in the world, answering an advertisement from a stranger because you'd run out of better options. I wasn't foolish either, Augusta said, watching their daughter outside the window. Watching their son chase his chicken into the afternoon light. I was hoping. There's no foolishness in that either. Only the courage it takes to keep believing, even after the world's given you every reason to stop. He pulled her close then, the particular ease of 2 people built to fit each other exactly. No apology required on either side. And together they watched their children play in the golden light of a kitchen window that had, after everything, kept every promise it was ever asked to keep. Mrs. Pruitt visited that same afternoon, as she did most weeks now, arriving in the small cart Thaddeus had bought her 2 years prior when her old knees had started protesting the walkout from town. She found Augusta on the porch, watching the children, and settled into the chair beside her, with the easy familiarity of a woman who had become, over 5 years, something far more permanent in this family's life than a former landlady. You're looking well, Mrs. Pruitt observed, accepting the cup of tea Augusta offered. Marriage suits you. Always thought it would, once you found the right man for it. How did you know? That first night, when I was nothing but a stranger off a train with nowhere to go. Mrs. Pruitt considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. I didn't know, exactly, she admitted. But I'd watched Thaddeus Corrigan go through 3 years of grief, without letting a single soul close enough to help him carry it. And then I watched the way he looked at you, that first night, like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to see someone clearly, instead of through a fog of his own sorrow. She sipped her tea. Some things you can't know for certain, but you can recognize them when they're standing right in front of you. Augusta watched her daughter Sarah show her younger brother how to stack the smooth river stones into careful towers, the particular patient tenderness of an older sibling, already learning to nurture rather than dominate. "I'm grateful," she said quietly, "for that first night. For every kindness after it. You've thanked me 100 times over these 5 years," Mrs. Pruitt said, waving a hand. "I'll tell you what I always tell you. You don't owe me gratitude for recognizing what was plainly in front of me. A strong woman, deserving exactly the kind of love that doesn't ask her to be smaller. That's not charity, dear. That's simply paying attention." She stayed through supper, as she often did now, the table crowded with the particular warm chaos of a family that had grown, over 5 years, from two careful strangers into something neither of them could have imagined on that first dark night at an empty train station. It was, Augusta thought, watching her husband across the table, her daughter's small careful hands arranging stones, her son's gap-toothed laughter, filling a house that had once held its breath for 3 long years. Exactly the home she had crossed half a country to find, not because a stranger's letter had promised her a kitchen window, but because she had finally learned, somewhere between an empty train platform and a marriage built on equal ground, that the home worth finding was never about the window at all.